you. Our second speaker on this panel is Rory Weal. Rory is the Senior Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Trussell Trust, where he currently leads the Trussell Trust's Policy and Public Affairs team, which works to change policy to end the need for food banks in the UK. Very pertinent given what Philip was just saying. He's a Churchill Fellow, a Thorons Scholar, having spent time studying and sharing international approaches to tackling homelessness and poverty. Over to you, Rory.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm also very impressed that passed without a technical hitch, which I think is the first time I've seen a live stream at an event and nothing go wrong. It's great to be and to follow Philip. I think for those of us that have worked in this space, it's always hard for the situation not to become normalized, and I think that intervention 2018 was one of the jolts that we as a collective society needed to realize just how bad things had got and the action that was needed. And we see that in our work as the Trussell Trust. So for those who don't know, we support a network of 1,300 food bank centres across the UK, providing emergency food in communities the length and breadth of the United Kingdom. And what I'm going to be talking about a bit today is how things have changed in the last 5 years, what we're seeing, particularly as Philip touched on around food bank need, but wider experiences of destitution and hardship too. And in a sense, kind of everything's changed and nothing's changed. We've seen deepening of poverty, and I'll be talking about that. We have seen interventions like things like the furlough scheme and the UC uplift that showed what can happen with proactive government policy, but we've also seen those be withdrawn as quickly as they arrived. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So to start with, what is the situation on the ground and what's happened in the last 5 years? Well, it's a very timely conversation. Today, the Trussell Trust released our mid-year statistics, which is when we regularly publish data on the number of food bank referrals that we've seen in the network. And unfortunately, it makes for some fairly grim news. If just behind Philip, you can see on the screen, basically the figure that we've published is that 1.5 million food bank referrals occurred in the last 6 months to food banks just in the Trussell Trust network. Many other food banks, the Independent Food Aid Network, many other providers. This is just Trussell food banks, but as you can see there, a big increase since that visit in 2018. In the last year alone, a 16% rise, and we saw through the pandemic how some of those safeguards, like the UC uplift, may have had a bit of a protective effect, but with the withdrawal of that, the cost of living crisis, need is really acute at its highest level ever. And as an organisation, we don't think anyone should need to use a food bank to get by. We think it's unacceptable. So we're really intent on ensuring that we can create the conditions to see that line dramatically decrease over the coming years. And I'll talk a little bit more about the data we see in here. So in this period, I'm talking about April to September, just a 6-month period, 1.5 million people. We've seen 300,000 families push through the doors. We've seen a 47% increase in the number of children supported at food banks just since 2021, so over an even shorter period. And actually, in the last 6 months, we've seen a big rise in the number of people coming to food banks for the first time. Which I think will be kind of familiar to many people. Increasingly, people that are also working as well as not working, and that profile of people needing support has shifted too. In terms of what kind of food banks are telling us, it's firstly that people who, and this is a quote from one of the food banks in our network and the manager there, people who have been managing are now not able to manage, so those people coming in for the first time, but also the people that were already struggling when Philip's visit occurred. People coming in much more regularly in a much deeper form of poverty. It's not just the amount of people in poverty, it's the depth of poverty that I think we're seeing through the doors of food banks. And it's worth remembering, we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. 1 in 7 people face hunger. So that wider experience of food insecurity, extremely high. And that population is actually double the size of Scotland's, 11.3 million people. That's what the equivalent figure is. So in terms of who's at risk and who's more likely to need support, there's a lot of different groups that are more likely to be referred to a food bank. So, we see kind of carers, renters, people of colour, people identify as LGBTQ+, all overrepresented in needing support. So there's a real equalities and equality rights issue associated with this everyday right, being able to afford the essentials. But just a spotlight on one group that's particularly overrepresented is disability, disabled people. So a quarter of the population in the UK are disabled. That compares to half of all people that have been food insecure. But really shockingly, 7 in 10 people at Trussell Trust food banks are disabled. So a massive overrepresentation, and 75% saying that someone in their household is disabled. So you've got a really big overrepresentation here, and anyone that spent any time looking at the disability benefit system in the UK, this won't come as a huge surprise. How the system treats and engages with people with disabilities needs an awful lot of improvement, and I'll touch on that in a moment. One other thing I just come on to in terms of this experience is isolation, physical and social isolation. So the impact of having a lack of money, what that does in terms of people's connectivity. And something Philip said in talking about the response from the government, mentioning how food banks create solidarity. Well, yeah, they do, but that's because people have such a lack of resource in their lives and are so often isolated that food banks are that source of support. But that really shouldn't be acceptable. And we see that 1 in 4 people have contact with relatives, friends or neighbours less than once a month among people referred to food banks. And 1 in 6 don't have access to the internet. So there's a big conversation at the moment around disabled people moving into work, and the government's unveiled reforms to do that. It relies on this big increase in remote working, but one of the things we know is that 1 in 6 have no internet access. So there's real limitations in how we're even thinking about the problem and the access requirements that people have. So this whole experience kind of need for food banks, it's tied to all these other experiences too. And I think it's not just about lack of food when it comes to food banks. It's about low savings, debt, isolation, adverse events, unemployment, ill health. All of these things create a spiral that suck people in and push people through the doors of food banks. And it's that we need to focus on and which we need to change. So I'd like to talk a little bit now about kind of what's driving this and what's behind that. Many different things. One thing I will focus on now is the social security system. 6 in 10 people in receipt of universal credit have faced hunger in the last year. We know that the vast majority of people at food banks are claiming social security benefits. And the challenges that we see, we've done a lot of work, a lot of participatory policy development with people with experience, a lot of other research work. And it's a combination of the problems in the system that people will be familiar with, the lack of kind of access, many of the kind of hurdles that people have to jump through to make a claim. But it's also about the pure insufficiency of the system. And this is something that, again, we've seen in the last 5 years. The further erosion in the basic value of benefits in this country means people just don't have enough money to afford the essentials. So it's those low levels of income through the benefit system that's really driving people often to support. And just a couple of quotes from people in terms of the experience that people have had of accessing support through the benefit system. It's not just the low income, it's also how people are made to feel. A real lack of humanity, a real lack of dignity. I mean, this quote feels like they want you to disappear and go away. I think we've created so many kind of what they call in economics ordeal mechanisms in the system. And yes, it's creating a huge amount of huge ordeal for people, and people aren't applying, people are delaying applications. And this isn't what our social security system was created to deliver. We've fallen really far from that mission. So to touch on the point around insufficiency, we know universal credit's too low. We've tried to do a bit of work to look at what it would look like to create a more sufficient system. And ourselves and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have looked at what a system that just allowed people to afford the essentials in life. So that's not even full kind of societal participation. That's going, to afford the essentials. So no one needs to turn to a food bank, so that people can afford energy and electric, can afford a roof over their heads. It's about £120 in this study, but universal credit standard allowance is just £85, and that's a massive shortfall, even just to meet the ability to afford those basic essentials. So kind of what do we do about this, and where do we take it? And I think there's a lot of work going on to try and shift the dial here that I'd like to touch on. Firstly, there's a lot of we talk a lot, I think, in the space around negative attitudes and stigma, and there is a lot, but there's also a real grain of public opinion that we can work with here. And we know that the public are increasingly concerned about these issues. If you look at public concern around poverty, compared with 5 years ago, it's actually it's quite dramatically increased in a lot of the polling. So we can see the majority of the UK public think food banks shouldn't be needed. I think it's a good place to start from. When you ask people if people should be able to buy enough food and you just focus it on the kind of the everyday rights almost framing, affording those basic essentials, you're looking at 93%. And that's something that goes across the kind of political divides. I think a lot of people also recognise food banks don't solve the root causes. And I think we'd all be in agreement about that. It's not a long-term solution to the problem. So kind of lots to work with there. There are real challenges. We've seen some of these things dip a little bit in the last year, which is quite concerning, but still a higher level of support than when we did equivalent polling 5 years ago. So what do we want to do about it? Well, I think this is something that has changed in the last 5 years, which is that I think as a movement and as a sector, we're really trying to get on the front foot and establish what that vision means in practice. And to us, that means ensuring that we have this basic right, that we guarantee our essentials in the social security system, that the social security system ensures that everyone has enough to get by and afford those basic essentials, and that deductions, things like the benefit cap, things like the repayment of the 5-week wait advances, don't pull support below that level. And I think this is something that has really transformed in the last 5 years. I think that we see a huge movement supporting this goal, and many people here in the room today, I know the likes of Just Fair, Liberty, many others have kind of signed up to this vision and to this agenda, and it makes me really hopeful about the kinds of things that we can achieve. Compared with 5 years ago, we were always fighting individual policies, and I think it's time we got on the front foot. We establish what the kind of guarantees we need, what people should be entitled to. And if we do that, I think we'll begin to shift the centre of gravity and ensure that we create a future where no one needs to use a food bank to get by. Ending destitution and hunger in the UK should be achievable, is achievable, and it's events like this that help us move towards that goal to achieve it. Thank you very much.